So I want to make one announcement before I hand it over to Thruster. But you may have seen our table out in the lobby, and it was out there yesterday as well. But we have our Bible school that we've just started again, and this time we're calling it BibleStudyOffer.com. There are quite a few churches in this area that are using Bible Study Offer as a platform for getting the Bible studies out to a lot of people. But I'm inviting all of you, if you're interested, to participate in our Bible school in two ways. One is to actually sign up for Bible studies. We have two different options that you can choose from, and I'm sure that if you sign up for those, you're really going to enjoy reading those lessons and learning more about what the Bible teaches about some really important things, and some of them that the things we'll be covering this week. But we also are looking for volunteers who can help with the Bible school as well, people who can help with running the school. So if either one of those applies to you, I invite you to come and find me at the table afterwards, and I'll just be out there in the lobby. So that's all I have for you now. But Thruster now is gonna. I'll turn the time over to him, and I hope you listen intently and learn something new this evening. Thanks.
Growing up in Iceland, you can't help but hear the stories of the Vikings and the gods that they worshipped and gave homage to. Iceland was, the first Vikings came to Iceland in the 800s. And when they came, we understand now that there were some Gaelic monks who were there already, worshiping God, fleeing Europe to get to a place where they could worship God. And the Vikings came with their heathen traditions. But by the year 1000, the Norwegian king was insisting that there be a transition to Christianity. He sent some missionaries, and they started working, and there was a split in the nation. There were two factions. The chiefs on one side wanted to follow Christianity, Catholic faith, and the chiefs on the other side wanted to continue with their pagan traditions. And they came to Althingi, to a place called Lögberg, or the Rock of Law. And it is right where the two plates, tectonic plates between Europe and America come together. You can see how they split there. And there is a gorge you can go into and walk around. Now, because of the number of tourists, you have to be careful where you can walk. There are special paths to go by. But the Vikings came there, and they just enjoyed nature. And they came together to make a decision, or they came to make war. They were ready to go to war and fight over to become Christian or pagan, to worship the God of the Bible, or the Thor and Ægir and Loki and Odin and all the others. And they were ready to split the nation, the small nation, in two, one law on one side, another law on the other side. But they had already established a very careful, systematic presentation of laws that governed the nation. And so when they came there, they thought, why should we fight over this? Why don't we give one of our chiefs the responsibility to think through and give us a recommendation what we should do? And the chief that was chosen was Þorgeir Þorkelsson, often known as Þorgeir Ljósvetningar-Goði. He was heathen. He worshipped Thor and Ægir and Freyja and Frigg and all the other gods. And he took it on himself, went into his tent, went under a sheepskin, and stayed there overnight and the next day. When he came out, he called everybody to Lögberg, to the Rock of Law, and said, come, and he started talking to them. He started arguing that it was important to have unity in the nation, to reflect and respect the laws of the nation. And as he went on, he got everybody in agreement with him, and then he said, we will all become Christians, be baptized into Christ and be Christians, but we can continue to carry out children, to sacrifice children. We can continue to eat horse meat, and we can continue with our heathen practices as long as there was not a public witness to it. And so the nation agreed. And the chiefs of Iceland, they said, the Viking chiefs, they said, let's all become Christian and we'll follow these principles. And so they did. And the national religion of Iceland was changed. First in the year 1000, when they became Christian, Catholic Christian, and then again in the year 1550. Now the Danish king wanted to change the religion of Iceland to have more control and make it Lutheran, make it Protestant, so he would have more political power in Iceland. So he sent missionaries to Iceland, and you had the two powers, or two religions, Catholic and Lutheran, two divisions in the country. And finally, in 1550, the Lutheran missionaries went and beheaded Jón Helgason, the bishop of the Catholic Church, and his two sons. And the nation became Lutheran. And so Iceland has twice changed religion by a decree of law. One time without shedding blood, the other time by beheading the bishop and his two sons. And really the question comes, so, is there a God? Should we worship a God? Do we know that a God exists? How do we know that a God exists? Is there anything for us to choose? Or do we take the words of Karl Marx and say religion is a sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of the heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions? It is the opium of the people. Is that what religion is? And there are a lot of people today who question the existence of God. And no wonder, because there are so many Christian churches, so many non-Christian denominations, so many different religions. There is Protestants, there is Catholic, there is Jews, there is now Islam, who is gaining prominence. Then you have the Eastern philosophies of Confucianism, Hinduism, Buddhism, everything in between. Some say there is God, some say there is not God. And the question comes, how can we know? Is there any way for us to really know that there is a God or whether there is no God? Doesn't matter what religion we follow. Does it really matter? If there is no God, it makes no difference what you believe. If there is a God, it makes a difference. The problem we have today is so many people make an opinion about God and say, this is what I think God is, this is what I believe God is. But if God exists, we cannot dictate who He is. We can only discover who God is and choose then whether we like Him or not. Whether we want to follow Him or not, whether we want to worship Him or not. That's really the only choice we have. First to decide, does God exist? And that's the question we want to address tonight. Then, if God exists and there's evidence for that, then we can choose what kind of God is it. Do I want to follow that kind of a God? So how do we know if there is a God at all? How do we know? Or can we know if there is a God? We can't put God in a test tube, put Him in a glass and say, okay, how does God look today? Is there a God? There's some things we do know. You'll pay taxes. One day, we'll die. We don't like those two facts, but then the question comes, are you sure those are facts? Some people say, oh, I'm never going to die. And yet nobody has brought evidence about that. Taxes? Yeah, we got to pay taxes. The question persists, how do we know? Can we be sure that what we know is reality and not just fake news? Did someone make it up? How do you know that it's real? You may have seen this picture. What do you see? Psychology likes to play games with this. Do you see a callus or do you see two people? How many see the callus? How many see the two people? You see both. You've seen this picture before, right? And this one, you've seen this one? What's the question on this one? Which is longest, which is shortest? And if you look at it, the eye tells you, the mind tells you the lowest one is the longest one. But if you measure them, they're all identical. And I love this one. Have you seen this one before? It's pretty common. A young girl or an old lady? Which is it? How many see the old lady? How many see the young lady? Hard to see, huh? No, these are two ladies. The graphic on the big screen are not as bright as the one in the back. Look in the back there on the screen. You see that? That's a little bit better. Okay? The big screen just washes out. Okay. But it's important to know and to have the evidence. If you want to know something, you need to be sure you can test it, try it out, and know that it's true. And there are 4 ways to know. First way is knowledge of tenacity. I know it. It is this way. I'm going to hold on to it because I'm stubborn. I'm not going to change. I'm holding on to this belief no matter what it is because my parents believed it, my grandparents believed it. I've always had it that way, and that's what it is. You can also know something because of authority. Someone who is an expert, someone you look up to. You may listen to your pastor or to someone else and say, this is what it is. A scientist may say, oh, there's global warming. Another scientist says, no, it's not global warming. Which do you believe? It may be depending on who is your authority. Maybe a politician tells you what it is. Whom do you believe? Some people believe based on the person of authority who tells that. There's also the a priori. Oh, it is that way. We always had it that way. And I don't really care, but that's how it is, and we're just going to continue with what we know. There's also a scientific way. And the scientific way has a specific process to go through to ask the questions. It has built-in checks to control, to verify, so we can attain dependable knowledge. Not just what I want it to be, but that I can look into it, I can research it, and you can research it, and we come to the same conclusion based on the evidence we examine. And in the scientific method, we insist on testing, and we insist on public scrutiny. It's not enough that I check it and tell you, oh, I checked it, and this is what it is. You have to be able to verify the method I used, the documents that I used, or the method I used, the experiment that I did, and be able to verify that what I found out is what you can find out too if you do the same study. Here we want objectivity. We don't want to base it on personal beliefs, on my values or my biases, my attitudes, or even my emotions. It needs to be clinical, it needs to be documented, it needs to be verifiable, that you and I can both check it out at different times and come to the same conclusion. The ultimate appeal of evidence and empirical testing. That's a scientific method. But there's a problem. How do we test and verify the existence of God? See, we often think of scientists as the white coat researcher, a brilliant individual who has a lot of math knowledge with engineering and technology. He goes into a lab and does an experiment, puts some things in a tube and looks at it and says, this is what it is. It's not always that way. Not all scientific research includes experiments. There are other ways also of knowing. There are quasi-experiments. If you go to social sciences, you can't go into a classroom and study children in a classroom and put them in a lab and say, I'm going to put them in a test tube and check things out. You have to go to university, get permission, and there is an institutional review board that looks at what you're going to do, make sure you don't damage the kids you're studying. And you can't always study directly, but you try to study the results. And so there are ways of checking and verify what is going on without having the case in a test tube. And you can also validate historical evidence, see if it holds up, if there are other evidences in history that can verify that. And if you look at science, scientific method, there are 2 basic ways. One is static view and a dynamic view. The static view, it goes into the test tube a very fixed way, one method, and you do that again and again. A dynamic view, or a heuristic view, it looks at problem solving as a method that is creative and yet grounded in theory. That there is a foundation, philosophical foundation, as to how we're going to look at it, how we're going to find the answer, And based on those assumptions, based on the method, based on how we approach it, you can go and do the same thing. And basic aim of science is not to make humanity better, but to support a theory, to find evidence for or against the theory. That's the aim of science. Then it's up to people to make things better. We can ask a question about God. Is there evidence for a God? And we can make a hypothesis, and we can ask the question, look at the evidence and the data, and we can come to a conclusion. But that does not change your life. That does not change society. That follows. What do you do with the evidence that you find? What do you do with the conclusions you come to? And so a theory is a proposition of constructs, ideas that you present, and you look at how the variables relate to each other, and you try to explain a phenomena through that study. So, for example, a scientist might study a classroom in order to understand school failure. They may do surveys, they may do observations, and they may then try to explain failure, what happens and why failure happens, so that they can predict why and how. Once you understand that, the teachers can then take that information and try to prevent failure. But the scientists may not do that. Scientists just present the data, present the conclusions, and then it's up to others to make the changes. There's some questions we just can't test empirically. How do we know? How do you know that you are here tonight? You must say, oh, that's a dumb question. I know I'm here. I am here. Well, believe me, philosophers have come up with some strange ideas about whether we're here or not. We'll leave that there. And while God is not placed in a test tube, the question comes, is it possible to verify the existence of a God? Can we verify the existence of a God? We can formulate a hypothesis. We can ask a question. We can seek answers to the questions. And we can verify the question or the data that helps us to answer that question. But keep in mind, a hypothesis is never really proven or disproven. It is simply a tool to guide the inquiry. Hypothesis is simply a tool to guide the inquiry. And so we would say at the conclusion of a study, the weight of the evidence is on the side of. As I look at the evidence, the weight of the evidence is on the side of this conclusion. So, how can we seek an answer to our question? Does God exist? How can we research that? How can we find that? How can we verify that? Or can it be verified? Again, we can't put God in a test tube, but we can propose a question. Is there a God who is interested in human life? Is there a God who is interested in human life? And I put God there in lowercase letters intentionally. Is there a God who is interested in human life? Then we can look for evidence to support or validate a hypothesis and or belief, or disallow both. When we look at the evidence, we may come to a conclusion and say, oh, there is no God. Or we may come to a conclusion, yes, there is evidence that supports my belief that there is a God. How do you know? Again, 4 ways. You can hold on to your old belief in tenacity. You can accept whatever an authority tells you, or just because it is, you're always going to be there. Or you can ask the questions as a scientist. In a modern way, is there a God, and how do I know if there is a God? A lot of Christians don't ask that question. A lot of Christians accept whatever the pastor tells them. A lot of church-going people, they just believe in tenacity or by authority or by a priori and don't go and ask the question in a scientific way. Does a God exist? And the follow-up question comes in later. If God exists, who is he? And what does he want of us? We have built-in checks to control, to verify, to attain a dependable knowledge. We can be objective. We can set aside our beliefs as we ask the question, set our values, biases, attitudes, emotions aside, and we can ask the questions clearly and without any fear. what will I find? And some people may say, oh, I shouldn't ask those questions. That's heresy to question whether God exists. No, that's a valid question. Now they say, there is no God. There is no evidence for a God. Well, how do you know? Why don't you check it out? On both sides, it is important, it is good to pause for a moment, ask the question, and to look for the evidence. The ultimate appeal to evidence and empirical testing. The question is, and the challenge is, what are you going to do if there's evidence in one way or the other? How will it affect you? Are you ready to embrace evidence that is verifiable for the existence of a God or for no existence of a God? Again, do you hold on tenacity? Do you hold on what the pastor tells you or what you always believed? Or are you willing to go and ask the questions? I could take you through multiple faiths, multiple stories of gods, Thor, Ægir, Freyja, and how they fought the giants and how they battled each other, the stories of deceit and death and destruction and recreation, from the Icelandic sagas and ending in the Ragnarök, destruction and then recreation. I could take you to the Roman gods, the Greek gods. I could take you to the Far East, to the philosophies and the gods who are there. And we could spend all night, but I'm going to take a shortcut because I have studied some of this. And I'm going to check out the claims of one God. There's one God who gives evidence to support his claim. He says, this is why I am God. Here, go and check it and see if it is true. Two verifiable claims that are stated and given. They are given in the Bible. The God of the Bible gives two very clear statements. He says, this is why I am God. Go and check it out and see for yourself whether I exist or not. A lot of people don't know this. But the Bible makes these very clear claims. Either they are true or they are false. If they are true, what are you going to do with it? If they are false, the God of the Bible is not valid, does not exist. First claim, God says, I am God because I create. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that claim tonight. A lot of people say there's evolution, creation can't be. I'm just going to put this here in front of you. I'm going to read one scripture. Isaiah 40, verse 25, it says, to whom will you compare me? Or who is my equal, says the Holy One. God says, who is like me? Who is equal to me? Anyone who wants to be God can do the same as the God of the Bible. Lift up your eyes, look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry hosts one by one and calls forth each one of them by name. Because of his great power, a mighty strength, not one of them is missing. God says, I create, I uphold the stars, I uphold the universe, and because of my presence, they are there. In Romans 1, God then adds and says, the evidence of my existence is seen in nature. Because of that, all mankind are without excuse. Interesting. So let's leave that there. Let's go to the second claim. God says, I am God because I know the future. This is a claim that we can verify, we can check, we can see what God said, we can go to history and look at the data, and we can show that either it's plausible or it is not plausible. Look at this text, Isaiah 44, verse 6. This is what the Lord says, Israel's King and Redeemer, the Lord Almighty, I am the first and I am the last. Apart from me, there is no God. God says, I am exclusive. Either that is true or that is not true. And the evidence is here. Who then is like me? Let him proclaim it. Let him declare and lay out before me what has happened. Since I established my ancient people and what is yet to come, yes, let them foretell what will come. God says very categorically, anyone who claims to be God, they have to be able to tell what happened in ancient days and be able to predict and foretell what will come in the future. So, what does God tell about the future? Can we verify it objectively without putting our values, beliefs, biases, attitudes, and emotions into that? Can we find the data, look at what God foretold about the future, and can we go in history and see what God said if that happened? Does God know the future? Is there evidence for the claim that he makes? Let's go to Daniel. We'll look at 3 passages, or 3 chapters in Daniel. I'm not going to read the whole chapters, but I want to point you to these places because this is verifiable. In Daniel 2, verse 39, Daniel is speaking to the king Nebuchadnezzar. He says, after you, Nebuchadnezzar, after Babylon, another kingdom will arise. It is inferior to yours. And then a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything, and the iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the other. And so Daniel tells, or God through Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, you are great, and there will be another kingdom, a second one after Babylon, and then a third one after you, and finally a fourth one. Oh, you can say, oh, that's easy to predict. Then you can say there's a fifth one after that. Well, notice what God says to Daniel. Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly baked of clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strength of the iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron, partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be mixture and will not remain united, any more than iron mixes with clay. So God says very clearly, Babylon, second kingdom, a third kingdom, an empire, and a fourth empire. After that, broken into multiple nations, trying to come together, but they will not create another empire that rules the earth. What's interesting is that so many people have recognized this claim, this prophecy, this prediction, and tried to make it untrue. They've tried to prove and say, oh, God doesn't know what he's talking about, and they've gone deliberately to work at it, to create another empire that rules the world. They say, oh, we have proven God untrue, and therefore shown that God does not exist because he doesn't know what the future is. Nebuchadnezzar II, Daniel was serving, lived from 634 to 562 and reigned from 605 to 562 BC. We know, and we know from archaeological evidence, that the book of Daniel was written at that time. 2,500 years, and the predictions that God made 2,500 years ago still hold today. Does God know the future? We can check the evidence. We can verify that it was spoken 2,500 years ago. We can check in history, see that it has held all these years. And the claim God made that I am God because I know the future, here's an instance we can see that it holds true. The dream of Daniel was in the second or third year of Nebuchadnezzar. It says, Babylon, you're a head of gold, 3 more empires, mixture of nations, until God intervenes. That's history. And it is verifiable up to this day today. God says, I know the future, and we can test it, we can verify it, and we can see that there is someone behind who knows. If I know even 5 minutes into the future, I will be a very wealthy man. I could play the stock market better than anybody else. I can't even take a deck of 52 cards and tell you with certainty which card comes up next, unless I take it, open it without shuffling it. Because I know what the cards are, but I don't know the future. Stock market traders will try to tell what's coming. They will try to predict, they will buy and sell based on the best guesses. And sometimes they cheat and get information to help them to beat the market. They're not supposed to do that, but they cannot tell the future 5 minutes into the future with certainty. We try, we guess, we use statistical modeling, but we can't tell with certainty. But God says, I can. That's why I am God. And I know what the future holds. Generals and kings, politicians try to break the prophecy of Daniel 2, but they cannot do it. Daniel 8, here's another text that God spoke. He said, I am going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. Then he says, the two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. Babylon is no longer a factor. And Daniel speaks now to another king and says, the vision you saw, a two-horned ram, that's king of Media and Persia. Okay, that's at that time. Then he says, the shaggy goat is the king of Greece. And the large horn between his eyes is the first king. How would he know that? How would he be able to predict that Greece would be the next empire? He doesn't just say there's another kingdom. He says who that empire is going to be. And then he adds and says, the four horns that replace the one that was broken represents four kingdoms that will emerge from this nation. They will not have the same power. He says basically, after the first king of Greece, who will be very powerful, and we know in history was Alexander the Great, it will be divided into four kingdoms, but they will not be as strong. And history tells us that when Alexander the Great died, his four generals came together and said, why should we kill each other? Why should we go to war? The empire is so big, let's divide it into four parts. Each one takes one, and that's what they did. And God said, long before, the nation will come called Greece. And they will divide into four parts. What's interesting is that when Daniel made this prediction, when Medo-Persia were beginning emerging, Greece had not yet become a powerful kingdom. In the future, when Daniel speaks, is yet to come Xerxes, the king, who goes to Greece and fights the 300 Spartans, among others. That is still future history when Daniel speaks. And God, through Daniel, says very clearly, after Medo-Persia, Greece will become strong. There will be a king coming who will sweep over the nation, but he will die, and it will split into four parts. Now talk about detail, knowing that years in advance. But maybe the greatest evidence for God's existence is found in Daniel chapter 9. Again, I'm going to go briefly through and summarize. In verse 25, it says, no one understands this. From the time of the word goes out to restore, rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes. The anointed one can also be translated the Messiah. The anointed one, the Messiah, the Christ. And so from a time of rebuilding, the decree is given to rebuild until the anointed one. He says there will be 7 sevens, 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. What the chapter is giving us is the 5 following details. It tells us when Jesus will come and be anointed, be baptized. It tells us the length of his ministry, 3.5 years. We'll come to that text. And the time of his crucifixion, when he will be cut off. The time that Christians are going to be scattered, and that after that time, Jerusalem will be destroyed. That is all found in this one chapter. The decree we know was given in 457 BC, and we read in the text 7 sevens and 62 sevens, which is total of 69 sevens, or 463. And in scripture and prophecy, and I'll show you a text in a little bit, it represents 463 years. Jesus was baptized in the year 27. How do we know that? Let's back off a little bit. Here we read in Numbers, for 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days, you explore the land, you will dislike to have me against you. There are a couple of other passages that talk about the same thing, where God says, I will speak in terms of 1 day, and that each day represents 1 year. Because we had the spies go through the country 40 days, I'm going to give you 40 years, 1 year for every day. And so if you go to the prophecy, we go to 483, which is the time given, and then minus the year the decree is take place, 457. That gives us 26. And then you have to add 1 year because the year 0 does not exist in history. And you come to year 27 AD. And what did the text say? The anointed would come. The Messiah would come. And if we look in the book of Luke, chapter 3, we read, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius, Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene. Do you see how many names are mentioned? We can verify Tiberius, Pontius Pilate, Herod, his brother Philip, Trachonitis, and Lysanias. We can verify all these individuals in history. And it says, during the high priest of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. And Jesus came and was baptized and was anointed as the Messiah. How does God know that? How can God, 500 years in advance, tell us when the Messiah comes, when he is anointed, what he's going to do when he begins his ministry? And then he adds this: he will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. And so the last 7 of the 77s, the last one of them. And he says in the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. When did sacrifices end? When Jesus died on the cross, the curtain of the temple, the most holy place, was torn from the top down. No man could have torn that from the top down, because the curtain, history tells us, was so thick as a man's hand. Torn. And the only sacrifice that day, that Passover, was the sacrifice of the Messiah, Jesus, in the middle of the last 7. So repeatedly, we see God predicting, telling us specific events that will take place. Kingdoms, nations, naming nations, stating what will happen, and stating when the Messiah will come, when he will be anointed, and when he will be cut off, when he will be killed. There are many, many other prophecies in the Scriptures. And these give additional detail about the times, about the future. Many have been fulfilled, and there is no failed prediction in the Bible. We might say, oh, we can guess the future. Haven't you read about Nostradamus? He guessed the future too. Well, there's a difference. In the Bible, no matter what translation you take, what language you take, they're all consistent. And the word that God gives of very specific predictions are to the T. And they're fulfilled, every one of them. Nostradamus, he spoke very vaguely and wrote in French. If you take his writings in Swedish and Icelandic, in English, because I'm familiar with those three, each translation is different because the translator interprets what he says. Not writing down what he said, because what he said is gibberish, hard to understand, vague, trying to guess the future. I can guess the future. I can tell you that probability that there will be a volcanic eruption in Iceland in this year or next year. That's pretty likely. Within the next 5 years, eruption will come in Iceland. I can tell you that. I can tell you that with probability there will be some earthquakes. But those are my guessing based on probability. God claims, I don't guess, I know the future. And that is a claim that is verifiable, because you can take the ancient scriptures, you can compare them with history, and you can see if the claims that God made are true or not. The evidence for God's existence, the God of the Bible, is very available, and it is testable in a scientific way. Now, as a scientist, I can study kindness, but I can't put kindness in a test tube. I can only make a statement about what I expect kindness to do in the lives of people. And then I can measure if that impact is present. I can see if kindness impacts the relationship of people, and based on that, I can conclude and say, I believe that kindness is in existence in this community. Or I can say it does not exist in that community. With God, I cannot put God in a test tube, but I can say he makes a claim that he knows the future. And I can take his predictions about the future, I can check the existing record of history and compare the two, and there is a perfect, complete match. Anybody can go and verify that. The second claim that God makes is, I am God because I know the future. God doesn't guess the future. He knows the future. He says, that is why I am God. It is an objective test that you can verify, irrespective of your beliefs, irrespective of your values, your biases, attitudes, and emotions. You can take the scriptures, you can take the history, you can look at it too and see, do these fit? Do these fit with the claim that God knows the future? If it fits, it supports the hypothesis in a very positive way that God does exist. Does God know the future? Is there evidence for the claim? Yes, there is. There's a follow-up question. So what? So what? So, okay, I see the evidence God exists, but so what? How does that affect me? And what kind of God is it? Is it a God that is kind and loving? Is it a God that is criminal, who is evil? What is the character of God? Just to know that God exists doesn't convince me whether I want to know him or not. Tonight we've asked the one question: does God exist? And you can hold on to your old beliefs. You can listen to your preacher or your politician or your professor. Or you can go and check the evidence. You can just accept whatever you've always believed, or you can go and check the evidence. What are you going to base your belief on? But the question comes back. Does God exist? There's no question in my mind that God exists. I'll show you more evidence later during this week. But the question is also, is God criminal? What kind of character does God have? That's the question we'll address tomorrow night. The question tonight is simply this: what are you going to do with the evidence? Are you going to check it out yourself? I've shown you the claim that God makes. I've shown you that the God of the Bible states, I know the future. I've given you evidence in Daniel 2, Daniel 8, Daniel 9, multiple other passages. Go to history. Check it out. And if you see that evidence there is a God, the question comes, what next? What are you going to do with it? Tomorrow night, we'll ask the question, what kind of character is God? Is he a criminal? Is he evil? If he wants to burn people, isn't that evil? What kind of God is it? Is he angry? Is he revengeful? What kind of God is it? If he exists, do I want to know him? That we'll ask tomorrow night. But right now, let me conclude with a prayer. Lord God, I have seen the evidence that you exist. There is no doubt in my mind that you are real. You're alive and well. But there are many in this world, many who are listening, many who will watch this and see on internet for maybe weeks to come, who may have questions. But we have gone through the evidence, the one claim that you make, that you know the future. And I pray, Lord, that you speak to each individual, give us the conviction and the courage to follow up and ask the next question: who are you? And I trust that you will answer these questions for us well. For I ask and I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you for coming tonight. Tomorrow we'll go back to another question. Is God criminal? And if you go in the foyer, there are some refreshments there. Hang out for a while. Let's chat and talk.